From childhood's hour I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my heart to joy at the same tone. And all I loved alone. Then, in my childhood, in the dawn of a most stormy life, was drawn from every depth of good and ill the mystery which binds me still. From the torrent or the fountain, from the red cliff of the mountain, from the sun that round me rolled in its autumn tint of gold, from the lightning in the sky as it passed me flying by, from the thunder and the storm and the cloud that took the form when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon in my view.
I am come of a race noted for vigor of fancy and ardor of passion. Men have called me mad, but the question is yet to be settled whether madness is or is not the loftiest intelligence, whether much that is glorious, whether all that is profound does not spring from some disease of thought, from moods of mind exalted at the expense of the general intellect. They who dream by day are cognizant of many things which escape those who dream only by night. In their gray visions they obtain glimpses of eternity and thrill in awakening to find they have been on the verge of the great secret. We will say then that I am mad. I grant at least there are two conditions of my mental existence. The condition of a lucid reason, not to be disputed in belonging to the memory of events forming the first epoch of my life, and a condition of shadow and doubt, appertaining to the present and to the recollection of what constitutes the second great era of my being. Therefore, what I shall tell you of the first period, believe, and to what I may relate of the later time, give only such credit as may seem due, or doubt it altogether. Or if doubt it ye cannot, then play unto its riddle the Oedipus. She whom I loved in my youth was the sole daughter of the only sister of my mother, long departed. Eleonora was the name of my cousin. We had always dwelled together beneath a tropical sun in the valley of the many-colored grass. No unguided footsteps ever came upon that vale, and to reach our happy home, there was need of putting back with force the foliage of many thousands of forest trees and of crushing to death the many millions of fragrant flowers. Thus it was that we lived all alone, knowing nothing of the outside world, I and my cousin and her mother. From the dim regions beyond the mountains, there crept out a narrow and a deep river, brighter than all save the eyes of Eleonora. We called it the River of Silence, for there seemed to be a hushing influence in its flow. No murmur arose from its bed, and so gently it wandered along that the pearly pebbles upon which we loved to gaze far down within its bosom stirred not at all, but lay motionless. The margins from the river to the mountains were carpeted all by a soft green grass, besprinkled throughout by the yellow buttercup, the white daisy, the purple violet, and the ruby red asphodel. that its exceeding beauty spoke to us of the love and of the glory of God. Hand in hand about this valley, for 15 years roamed I with Eleonora before love entered within our hearts. It was one evening that we sat, locked in each other's embrace, and looked down within the water of the river of silence at our images therein. We spoke no words during the rest of that sweet day, and our words even upon the morrow were tremulous and few. We had drawn the god Eros from that wave, and now we felt that he had enkindled within us the fiery souls of our forefathers. A change fell upon all things. Strange, brilliant flowers, star-shaped, burst out upon the trees where no flowers had been known before. The tints of the green carpet deepened, and when one by one the white daisies shrank away, there sprang up in place of them 10 by 10 of the ruby-red asphodel. And life rose among our paths. For the tall flamingo, hitherto unseen, flaunted his scarlet plumage before us. Golden and silver fish haunted the river, out of the bosom of which issued, little by little, a murmur that swelled at length into a lulling melody more divine than the harp of Aeolus, sweeter than all save the voice of Eleonora. The loveliness of Eleonora was that of the seraphim, but she was a maiden, artless and innocent as the brief life that she had led among the flowers. No guile disguised the fervor of love which animated her heart, and she examined with me its inmost recesses as we walked together in the valley of the many-colored grass and discoursed of the mighty changes which had lately taken place therein. At length, having spoken to me one day in tears of the last sad change that must befall humanity, she thenceforward dwelt only upon this one sorrowful theme, interweaving it into all our converse. She had seen that the finger of death was upon her bosom, that like the ephemeron, she had been made perfect in loveliness only to die. But the terrors of the grave to her lay solely in a consideration which she revealed to me one evening at twilight. She grieved to think that having entombed her in the valley of the many-colored grass, I would quit forever its happy recesses, transferring the love which was now so passionately her own to some maiden of the outer and everyday world. And then and there I threw myself hurriedly at the feet of Eleonora and offered up a vow to herself and to heaven that I would never bind myself in marriage to any daughter of earth, that I would in no manner prove recreant to her dear memory or to the memory of the devout affection with which she had blessed me. And I called upon the mighty ruler of the universe to witness the pious solemnity of my vow. And the bright eyes of Eleonora grew brighter still at my words, and she sighed as if a deadly burden had been taken from her breast, and she trembled, and she very bitterly wept. But she made acceptance of the vow, for what was she but a child? And it made easy to her the bed of her death. And she said to me, not many days thereafterward, tranquilly dying, that because of what I had done for the comfort of her spirit, she would watch over me in that spirit when departed, and if it were so permitted her, return to me visibly in the watches of the night. But if this thing were not permitted of the souls in paradise, that she would at least give me frequent indications of her presence, sighing upon me in the evening winds, or filling the air which I breathed with the perfume of the censers of the angels. And with these words upon her lips, she yielded up her innocent life, putting an end to the first epic of my own. Thus far I have faithfully said, but as I pass the barrier in time's path formed by the death of my beloved, and proceed with the second era of my existence, I feel that a shadow gathers over my brain, and I mistrust the perfect sanity of the record. But let me on. Years dragged themselves along heavily, and still I dwelled within the valley of the many-colored grass. But a second change had come upon all things. The star-shaped flowers shrank into the stems of the trees and appeared no more. The tints of the green carpet faded, and one by one the ruby-red asphodels withered away, and there sprang up in place of them 10 by 10 dark, eye-like violets that writhed uneasily and were ever encumbered with dew. And life departed from our paths. For the tall flamingo flaunted no longer his scarlet plumage before us, but flew sadly from the vale into the hills. And the golden and silver fish bedecked the sweet river never again. And the lulling melody that had been softer than the wind harp of Aeolus, and more divine than all save the voice of Eleonora, it died little by little away, until the stream returned into the solemnity of its original silence. Yet the promises of Eleonora were not forgotten. For I heard the sounds of the swinging of the censers of the angels, and the streams of a holy perfume floated ever and ever about the valley. And at lone hours, when my heart beat heavily, the winds that bathed my brow came unto me laden with soft sighs, and indistinct murmurs often filled the night air. And once, but once only, I was awakened from a slumber, like the slumber of death, by the pressing of spiritual lips upon my own. But the void within my heart even thus refused to be filled. I longed for the love which had before filled it to overflowing. At length the valley pained me through its memories of Eleonora, and I left it forever for the vanities and the turbulent triumphs of the world. I found myself in a strange city. The pomps and pageantries of a stately court, and the mad clangor of arms, and the radiant loveliness of women bewildered and intoxicated my brain. But as yet, my soul proved true to the vows, and the indications of the presence of Eleonora were still given me in the silent hours of the night. Suddenly, these manifestations, they ceased, and the world grew dark before mine eyes. And I stood aghast at the burning thoughts which possessed, at the terrible temptations which beset me. For there came from some far, far distant and unknown land a maiden to whose whole beauty my whole recreant heart yielded at once, at whose footstool I bowed down without a struggle in the most ardent, in the most abject worship of love. What indeed was my passion for the girl of the valley in comparison to the fervor and the delirium and the spirit-lifting ecstasy of adoration with which I poured out my whole soul in tears at the feet of the ethereal Ermengarde? Oh, divine was the angel Ermengarde! And as I looked down into the depths of her memorial eyes, I thought only of them and of her. I wedded, nor dreaded the curse I had invoked, and its bitterness was not visited upon me. And once, but once again in the silent hour of the night, there came through my lattice the soft sighs which had forsaken me, and they modeled themselves into familiar and sweet voice saying, "Sleep in peace, for the spirit of love reigneth and ruleth, and in taking to thy passionate heart her who is Ermengarde, thou art absolved for reasons which shall be made known to thee in heaven of thy vows unto Eleonora." That little story was written by Edgar Allan Poe in 1842, just as his wife, Virginia, began what would be a losing battle with consumption. In truth, the story is poetically symbolic of Poe's adult life, a life easily divided into two epochs. The first, 1836 through 1847, might be called the period of lucid reason, encompassing Poe's life with his young wife, Virginia. The second period, 1847 through 1849, was a time of shadow and doubt, in which Poe, devastated by the death of his wife, reached out to many women for companionship and comfort. Throughout his life, two passions remained: the need for a perfect woman and mother figure, and the desire to own his own literary magazine. To begin, Edgar Poe was born in Boston on the 19th of January, 1809, to actor parents. His father, David, a ne'er-do-well alcoholic, abandoned the family and died in October of 1811, leaving his 22-year-old wife alone with 3 children. Edgar's mother, Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins, a talented and beautiful lady of the stage, traveled from city to city, attempting to earn as much a living as theatrical engagements allowed. It was in Richmond, Virginia, on the 8th of December, 1811, that she died at the age of 24, leaving her children to be adopted by various families. 2-year-old Edgar entered the home of a very wealthy merchant named John Allan, hence the name Edgar Allan Poe. When Edgar was 6, business ventures took the Allans to England. 5 years later, they returned to Richmond, where Edgar, now 11, continued his education in local schools. At the age of 14, Edgar fell in love with Jane Stith Stannard, the mother of one of his young schoolmates. She encouraged his writing and became the first of many women immortalized by Poe in verse. His poem, To Helen, is dedicated to her. Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore that gently o'er a perfumed sea the weary, wayworn wanderer bore to his own native shore. On desperate seas long wont to roam, thy hyacinth hair, thy classic face, thy Naiad airs have brought me home to the glory that was Greece, to the grandeur that was Rome. Lo, in yon brilliant window niche, how statue-like I see thee stand, the agate lamp within thy hand. Ah, Psyche, from the regions which are Holy Land. This little poem reflects Poe's romantic image of the perfect woman, classical in form and in beauty, an image that would inspire much of his future work, and most especially drive a deeply personal, unfulfilled passion throughout his life. As a youth, Poe aspired to greatness and ardently desired what he called a collegiate education. At the age of 17, he entered the University of Virginia. The joys of childhood came to an end as he confronted challenges of young adulthood. For one reason or another, the relationship between the teenaged Poe and his stepfather, John Allen, was one of conflict. Reputed to be a hard-nosed businessman, perhaps Allen frowned on writing as a sensible career. Some believe that Allen himself actually had ambitions toward being a writer and was perhaps jealous of the talented youth. Overall, Poe was sensitive and needed attention, while Allen was considered a pragmatic stoic. In a letter to a friend, Poe stated that he actually overheard his stepfather tell a colleague that he had no affection for his stepson. Although inspired by Allen to receive the finest university education and attain what he called eminence in public life, ironically, Poe found himself destitute as his stepfather gave him little money to live on while at the university. Recalling the event some years later in a letter to Allen on the 3rd of January, 1831, Poe argued his financial predicament. "Sir, the expenses of the institution at the lowest estimate were $350 per annum. You sent me there with $110. Of this, $50 were to be paid immediately for board, $60 for attendance upon 2 professors, and you even then did not miss the opportunity of abusing me because I did not attend 3. Then $15 more were to be paid for room rent. Remember, all of this was to be paid in advance with $110. $12 more for a bed and $12 more for room furniture. I had, of course, the mortification of running into debt for public property against the known rules of the institution and was immediately regarded in the light of a beggar. You will remember that in a week after my arrival, I wrote to you for some more money and for books. You replied in the terms of the utmost abuse. If I had been the vilest wretch on earth, you could not have been more abusive than you were, because I could not contrive to pay $150 with $110. Financially strapped and unable to keep up socially with other young men from fine Virginia families, Poe looked for ways to multiply his assets. He gambled and he lost. He borrowed at high interest and he went deeper into debt. And now here a new demon entered his life. He discovered alcohol. And he found that merely one glass of wine had an overwhelming effect on him. He knew that he must turn away from drink, and yet he could not resist the fascination of its peculiar effects. Some historians contend that Poe's gambling debts approached $2,000 in 1826. Understandably irritated with his stepson's lack of discipline, John Allen found no choice but to remove the boy from the university. Upon his return to Richmond, it has been speculated that Poe learned of Allen's marital infidelities, and because he adored his stepmother, he may have threatened to expose the man. In all events, the relationship between stepson and stepfather reached a breaking point, and Poe left home for Boston. Whenever he found himself in dire straits and wrote Allen for money, the request usually went unanswered. Physical hardships were not Poe's only obstacle. An emotionally charged and passionate young man, orphaned at the age of 2, his sensitive heart continually suffered great loneliness. His life was driven by a deep need to find that perfect protector, a mother. Up against an intolerable world, he sought escape in writing, in romance, and frequently in excessive drinking. A year before his death in 1849, he wrote to poet Sarah Helen Whitman, "I have absolutely no pleasure in the stimulants in which I sometimes so madly indulge. It has not been in the pursuit of pleasure that I have periled my life and reputation and reason. It has been in the desperate attempt to escape from the torturing memories of a sense of insupportable loneliness and a dread of some strange impending doom. But now, in 1827, having departed his father's step-house and finding himself alone in Boston, the 18-year-old Edgar Allan Poe looked to writing as a means of support. He met a young printer in Boston who published a pamphlet of his work entitled Tamerlane and Other Poems. Unfortunately, it received neither critical acclaim nor success in sales. With no apparent prospects, what now does a young man bent on achieving eminence in public life do? Well, on the 26th of May, 1827, Poe enlisted in the Army under the name of Edgar A. Perry. Although he found little pride in being a soldier, on the 1st of January, 1829, he attained the rank of sergeant major. 3 months later, he obtained an honorable discharge. He then spent several months in Baltimore, staying at the home of his aunt, Maria Clem, and her 7-year-old daughter, Virginia, whom he tutored. In June of 1830, Poe entered the academy at West Point. It is said he began as a good student, but the disciplines of cadet life had little appeal to him. He behaved recklessly, neglected his duties, and was court-martialed on the 19th of February, 1831. He returned to Baltimore, taking up residence once again in the home of his aunt, Maria Clem, and her daughter, Virginia. This was the only family security he would ever know. In 1834, Poe's stepfather, John Allan, died. Allan had amassed tremendous wealth, and although he provided for his 3 legitimate and 2 illegitimate children, nothing in his will was left to Edgar Allan Poe. Undaunted, Poe turned to writing prose and won first prize by the Baltimore Saturday Visitor for his short story manuscript found in a bottle. He returned to Richmond in August of 1835, where he became assistant editor of the Southern Literary Messenger. His writing desk is in the outside exhibit. This began a period of numerous jobs in numerous cities over the remaining 14 years of his life, during which he never abandoned the dream of owning his own literary magazine. Now, it was at this point in his life that a Victorian-like romance blossomed between Poe and his aunt Maria Clem's teenage daughter, Virginia. Poe expected that Mrs. Clem and Virginia would join him in Richmond. Mrs. Clem's suggestion that Virginia move to her cousin Nielsen Poe's home, where she might have greater opportunity for education and social development, struck Poe sharply in the heart. On the 29th of August, 1835, in a letter from Richmond to Mrs. Clem in Baltimore, Poe's depth of passion and his sense of the dramatic can be felt. My dearest auntie, I am blinded with tears while writing this letter. I have no wish to live another hour. Amid sorrow and the deepest anxiety, your letter reached, and you well know how little I am able to bear up under the pressure of grief. My bitterest enemy would pity me now could he read my heart. My only hold now on life is cruelly torn away. I have no desire to live and will not. But let my duty be done. You know I love Virginia passionately, devotedly. I cannot express in words the fervent devotion I feel towards my dear little cousin, my own darling. But what can I say? Oh, think for me, for I am incapable of thinking. It is useless to expect advice from me. What can I say? Can I in honor and in truth say, Virginia, do not go? Do not go where you can be comfortable and perhaps happy. And on the other hand, can I calmly resign my life itself? Adieu, my dear auntie. I cannot advise you. Ask Virginia. Leave it to her. Let me have under her own hand a letter bidding me goodbye forever. And I may die, my heart will break, but I will say no more. E.A.P. Kiss her for me 1,000,000 times. He then added a postscript to this letter. For Virginia. my love, my own sweetest sissy, my darling little wifey, think well before you break the heart of your cousin Eddie. And then he added a second postscript to Mrs. Clem. I opened this letter to enclose the $5. I have just received another letter from you announcing the receipt of mine. My heart bleeds for you. Dearest Auntie, consider my happiness while you are thinking of your own. I am saving all I can. The only money I have spent so far is 50 cents for washing. I still have $2.25 left. I will shortly send you more. Write immediately. I shall be all anxiety and dread until I hear from you. Try and convince my dear Virginia how devotedly I love her. God bless and protect you both. In May of 1836, Poe married his cousin Virginia, who was not yet 14 years old. No doubt he had strong feelings for her, yet there is speculation among scholars that Poe may have married Virginia simply to be near his aunt and now mother-in-law, Mrs. Maria Clem, in whom he seemed to have found an ideal mother figure. Over the next 11 years, he would move his family back and forth to many cities, taking on many jobs in the hopes of securing his lifelong dream, having his own magazine. That dream never came to fruition. Yet the travels from city to city continued. In 1841, the little family moved to Philadelphia, where Poe achieved great success in having published The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which gave birth to a new literary genre, the detective story. His new position as an editor at Graham's magazine in Philadelphia paid him $800 per year, probably the most he ever earned in a single year. He now began turning out masterpiece short stories on themes of entrapment, mind over matter, detection, madness, and murder. His many familiar titles include The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Black Cat, Manuscript Found in a Bottle, The Gold Bug, and The Telltale Heart. True. Nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain. But once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than in the week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed so that no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far so that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much so that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when the day broke, I went boldly into his chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone and inquiring how he had spent the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph to think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened for fear of robbers. And so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily. I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no, it was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise when he turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but he could not. He had been trying to say to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is nothing but a mouse crossing the floor. Or it is merely a cricket which is given a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he could neither see nor hear, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time very patiently without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a simple dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open. And I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon the damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? Now I say there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous, so I am. And now at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern, and I leaped into the room. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor, and I pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed, and I examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. But I had made an end to my labors. It was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bid them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought the chairs into the room and desired them to rest here from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat and still they chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct, and I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles and in a high key with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore, I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose above all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no. They heard. They suspected. They knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony, anything more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now again, hark, louder, 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 louder. Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. In January of 1842, 1 year before that story was written, Poe's young wife, Virginia, suffered a ruptured blood vessel while singing. The condition indicated signs of consumption, which would take a toll on her health over the next 5 years. Poe later commented on the event. Her life was despaired of. I took leave of her forever and underwent all the agonies of her death. She recovered partially, and again I hoped. At the end of a year, the vessel broke again, then again, and even once again. I became insane with long intervals of horrible sanity. During these fits of absolute unconsciousness, I drank, God only knows how often or how much. As a matter of course, my enemies referred the insanity to the drink rather than the drink to the insanity. During this period in 1845, Poe moved his family back to New York, where he found critical success in having published The Raven and other poems. He was now at the peak of his career as a writer, as a critic, and as editor of the Broadway Journal. However, as a literary critic, Poe was known for severity, including leveling an accusation of plagiarism at the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. His popularity among the literati was understandably strained. This and the demise of the Broadway Journal in 1846 left Poe in the continued struggle to make ends meet. On the 12th of June, 1846, he wrote to his wife, "My dear heart, my dear Virginia, our mother will explain to you why I stay away from you this night. I trust the interview I am promised will result in some substantial good for me, for your dear sake and hers. Keep up your heart in all hopefulness and trust yet a little longer. In my last great disappointment, I should have lost my courage, but for you, my darling little wife, you are my greatest and only stimulus now to battle with this uncongenial, unsatisfactory, and ungrateful life. I shall be with you tomorrow, p.m., and be assured until I see you, I will keep in loving remembrance your last words and your fervent prayer. Sleep well, and may God grant you a peaceful summer with your devoted Edgar." This was the final summer that Poe would spend with his beloved Virginia as her health worsened. 7 months later, in January of 1847, a friend visiting the Poe cottage in Fordham, New York, noted her condition. There was no clothing on the bed, but a snow-white spread and sheets. The weather was cold, and the sick lady had the dreadful chills that accompany the hectic fever of consumption. She lay on the straw bed, wrapped in her husband's great coat, with a large tortoiseshell cat on her bosom. The wonderful cat seemed conscious of her great usefulness. The coat and the cat were the sufferer's only means of warmth. Against Poe's wishes, an appeal for public aid was conducted. But on the 30th of January, 1847, Virginia Clem Poe died. The first epoch of Poe's adult life came to an end. He then immersed himself in writing Eureka, intended as a prose poem putting forth his theories of the universe. This was published in New York in June of 1848. 1 month later, Poe returned to Richmond, where it was reported he drank excessively and discoursed wildly on Eureka in all the local bar rooms. After Virginia's death, Poe entered into a state of emotional turmoil. Extreme loneliness drove him to pursue many romances that frequently ended in broken engagements, usually through the intervention of the family and friends of the betrothed. Distracted and broken-hearted, Poe fell vulnerable to the influences of bad company in these last 2 years of his life. His critics claim that he frequently drank to delirium. On the 7th of July, 1849, battling sorrow and loneliness, he once again turned to his aunt, Mrs. Maria Clem. My dear, dear mother, I have been so ill, have had the cholera or spasms quite as bad, and can now hardly hold the pen. The very instant you get this, come to me. The joy of seeing you will almost compensate for our sorrows. We can but die together. It is no use to reason with me now. I must die. I have no desire to live since I have done Eureka. I could accomplish nothing else. For your sake, it would be sweet to live. But we must die together. You have been all in all to me, darling, ever-beloved mother, and dearest, truest friend. I was never really insane, except on occasions when my heart was touched. I have been taken to prison once since I came here for getting drunk. But then I was not. It was about Virginia. On the 27th of September, 1849, Poe left Richmond for New York. His activity for the next week was unknown. Then in Baltimore, on the 3rd of October, Poe was found unconscious in the Lexington Market Square, lying across a butcher's block, covered with flies and dressed in clothing other than his own. A physician who had been his friend was notified. Poe was taken to the Washington College Hospital, where he regained consciousness. But in a state of delirium, he claimed to talk to spectral and imaginary objects on the wall. He had no recollection of what had happened to him. And for 4 days, he struggled on the verge of death. At 5 a.m. on the 7th of October, 1849, he cried out, "God help my poor soul," and he died. Edgar Allan Poe's anticipation of finding perfect bliss in death, and his recurring theme, the death of a beautiful woman, are most eloquently expressed in his final poem, composed 5 months before he died. It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than a love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And that was the reason that long ago in this kingdom by the sea, that a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know, in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind blew out of the cloud one night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we. And neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the stars never rise, but I see the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide, I lie down by the side of my darling, my life, and my bride, in the sepulchre there by the sea. resounding